May the 3rd is designated by the United Nations World Press Freedom Day. It commemorates the anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration in 1991, a set of principles set out by African newspaper journalists reaffirming the right to freedom of speech described in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Since 1997, UNESCO has marked the event by handing out the World Press Freedom Prize to an individual organization or institution doing most to uphold those principles. The prize is named in memory of Colombian journalist Guillermo Cano Izaza, who was assassinated in 1986 while investigating Colombia's powerful drugs barons. The recipient of this year's UNESCO Guillermo Cano Prize will be Lasantha Wickrematunge. As a prominent Sri Lankan journalist known for his outspoken style and with many friends among Sri Lanka's political elites, he was a target who paid the ultimate price when he was assassinated in January. UNESCO also convenes a conference each year bringing together media professionals, press freedom organizations and UN agencies in an attempt to gauge the state of press freedom worldwide and propose solutions to overcome curbs on the liberty of journalists. This year the event will take place in Sri Lanka, and a theme to be discussed is current challenges to the media. What do you consider to be the main challenges to press freedom today?
Well, first I want to wish you and all your viewers a very happy World Press Freedom Day.
Thank you.
I think there are myriad challenges. Certainly there's an enormous threat to journalists working online. That's something we're highlighting today. We released a list of places around the world, the worst places to be a blogger. Burma tops the list, Iran is number 2, Syria number 3, Cuba number 4, and these are all countries which broadly restrict the work of journalists online. That's an emerging threat that we're monitoring.
Yes, thank you very much. Same question to you, Sharif Nashashibi. What are the main challenges? Joel Simon talks about the threats that bloggers face. Bloggers obviously are a comparatively new development. More traditional forms of media, the press, television, radio, broadcasters, those sorts of people, what is the main threat to them?
Well, simply put, the main threat are governments, and particularly in conflict zones and times of war. You have governments, placing restrictions and even media bans on coverage of those conflicts, such as Sri Lanka at the moment, as Israel's invasion of Gaza recently. But this is nothing new. This is the same battle being waged between the media and governments that has gone on for time immemorial, basically. So it's the same problems, but as the other guest said, the battle is being waged online now as well because of the advancement of technology and the spread and the use and power of the internet. This is now the new battleground that is being waged online, as well as the more traditional areas of broadcasting and the press.
Joel Simon, there's been a great attempt on the part of government to mediate the internet. How successful has government been, and how much more successful have the media been in keeping one step ahead?
Well, I read a very interesting essay by your other guest, who described how, particularly in conflict zones, you're seeing the rise of citizen journalism, online journalism, non-traditional forms of media. That is very important. But the one thing that I think we need to be cognizant of is that governments are also aware of this new form of journalism and are taking measures to restrict it. And we're seeing that in many countries around the world. China is the world's leading jailer of journalists, for example. 24 of the 28 journalists in jail in China worked online. Burma, broad censorship. Iran, there are many restrictions on online journalists in Iran. Syria is another country. Cuba. So in all of these places, we're seeing the emergence of a new form of media online, but governments, there's a kind of information counter-revolution underway. Governments are broadly restricting, and we can't assume that the internet will be free. Governments are taking broad measures to restrict it.
Sharif Nashashibi, I was researching for another program yesterday, and I learned from the organization that Mr. Simon works for that since 1992, when they started to keep records, 744 journalists have been confirmed as killed in the line of duty, as it were. Now, almost 50%, about 48.5% of those, were killed challenging governments and rooting out corruption. So that does remain the main problem, doesn't it? How do journalists set about challenging governments at the same time as keeping on the right side of the law?
Well, yeah, this is a big problem that has been increasing, and certainly organizations such as the Committee to Protect Journalists have highlighted the fact that, journalists are continuously being killed simply for doing their jobs. And I think one of the problems that we've seen arising since the 1990s is the issue of embedded journalism, where one force, particularly let's say U.S. forces, will say, well, if the journalists don't embed with our forces, we can't guarantee their safety. And more often than not now, we're seeing cases where the media are bombed in circumstances that look fairly deliberate, although that's denied by governments and certain forces. But I think the issue of embedded journalism is used almost as a cover to say, well, you're an open target if you don't embed with us. But then that colors the whole objectivity of journalists who cover these conflicts. And I think this is a major problem that unfortunately people haven't learnt the lessons of. That embedded journalism does not produce or encourage objective journalism, and it simply provides excuses for those who are not embedded to be targets in those conflicts. And this is simply unacceptable.
Joel Simon, why do you imagine the military allowed embedded journalists to march with the military column in the first place?
Well, I have a slightly different perspective on embedded journalists. I think they're one perspective, and it's worth knowing the perspective of soldiers in both sides of a conflict. So I certainly wouldn't discourage militaries from allowing journalists from participating, from observing their activities. In fact, I think that kind of transparency is important. But it's only a small part of the picture. You need to also allow journalists to operate independently, to operate without the protection of military forces. And there's often hostility, very often hostility to journalists who refuse to participate in embedding programs. That's unfortunate. So I agree that it cannot be the sole perspective, but I do think it can add value to the overall picture of a conflict.
Okay, now you see the thing is that there have been very, very prominent examples of journalists. A colleague of mine, a British colleague of mine, Gabby Rado, who worked for ITN, refused to be embedded and died in northern Iraq. Is it that journalists become legitimate targets, almost, by the fact that they refuse to cooperate?
Is that a question for me?
It is, sir. It is to you, yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, there have been a number of, I think there's, in many circumstances where conflict is taking place, there's a deep suspicion of non-embedded journalists who are present on the battlefield. And there have been a number of journalists killed in these circumstances, and there haven't been adequate investigations. There have been military, there have been instances in which media outlets have been attacked. It certainly paints a picture of indifference at a minimum towards the presence of journalists in these conflict zones. So it's something we're absolutely concerned about.